Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hi, Eric. How are things going?
Oh, I'm really busy with my workload. Some professors assign so much reading that it's like they think we have no other homework.
One of the most important things you'll learn in college is how to manage your time. How to, prioritize. When to say no to a social engagement if you have a paper due, that sort of thing.
I guess so.
So, how are you finding the material we're covering in class?
I've actually come to talk to you about it. I have a 6-month-old niece, so I find early childhood development really interesting. Piaget, that Swiss psychologist you told us about, his development theory is really cool.
Yes, his theory that cognitive development in children occurs in 4 stages that you can actually observe.
Yeah, so my niece, she's in the sensory motor stage now, right at the part where she thinks things disappear when they're out of sight.
Very good. She probably won't understand that objects continue to exist even when they're out of sight until she's a month or so older.
Yeah. Yesterday, we were knocking a little ball around and it rolled under the couch. She immediately lost interest and reached for something else.
Because to her, the ball ceased to exist.
Yeah. I've actually been taking notes on her behavior because I'd like to write my term paper about her, if it's okay with you.
Your term paper?
Yeah, I'd like to do a case study or something. Piaget watched his kids and, changed the whole world of psychology.
Wait a minute. Piaget didn't just observe his own children. He did exhaustive research over 30 years to develop and test his theory. And anyway, your assignment isn't to do a study. It's to research the literature on a particular psychological topic and write about it. And I gave you a list of suggested topics to choose from.
Well, what if I research something like, is it possible to speed up cognitive development? Like, if I reached under the couch to get the ball while she watched me, would she learn earlier that objects don't disappear? Or can't 6-month-old babies think that way yet?
I do applaud your initiative, Eric. However, I sincerely doubt you could get any kind of valid or meaningful information from such an experiment.
But I already put so much time into watching my niece.
Remember, this is only a freshman psychology class. You aren't trained in carrying out an original research project. I wish you'd come to me earlier, but, there's still some time before the due date. I suggest that you recheck the list of topics. At least one of them relates to cognitive development. Then come see me again if you have any questions.
Okay.
Why does the student go to see the professor? Why does the student mention a particular stage in early childhood development? Why does the professor discuss Piaget's research method? Why does the professor reject the student's proposal to write about his niece? Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Would she learn earlier that objects don't disappear? Or can't 6-month-old babies think that way yet?
I do applaud your initiative, Eric.
Why does the professor say this?
I do applaud your initiative, Eric.
Listen to part of a lecture in a theater history class. The class is discussing 18th century plays in Europe and the United States.
By far, the most popular genre of plays during the 18th century was the sentimental comedy. Now, in order to sort of get our heads around what a sentimental comedy is, where it came from, and why on earth it was so popular, we need to understand what sentimentality was as a philosophical movement. So, during the 18th century, some thinkers, philosophers, political theorists, came up with this idea of sentimentality. The main point in sentimentality is that people are inherently good. People are good by nature. In the past, in other times, some people had believed or claimed that men and women are naturally selfish or naturally evil. During the 17th century, there was a very popular theory known as the social contract, set out by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, which argued that people are naturally selfish. During the 18th century, on the other hand, thinkers associated with sentimentality came along and said, no, people are naturally good. Yes, Diane, question.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but why was it called, that first one, the social contract? Why was it called that? I mean, if people are supposed to be naturally selfish, isn't that the opposite of being social?
The emphasis was more on the contract part. If people are naturally inclined to do what's in their own self-interest, then in order to have people living together in peace, you needed to develop some kind of a social contract, a sort of agreement. I won't hit you over the head and take your stuff if you don't hit me over the head and take my stuff. But in the 18th century, the sentimental theorists came along and said that people are naturally good.
Hard to believe sometimes if you watch the evening news.
Okay, if you try to argue that people are naturally good, you're going to have to answer the question, what about the fact that bad things happen? How do we account for the fact that people do bad things? Sentimental theorists claim that evil deeds happen because people are led astray by bad influences. That is, people can be pressured or seduced or tricked into doing something wrong. And the other question that comes up in relation to sentimentality is, if you are led astray, how can you be redeemed? Can you be brought back to your state of natural goodness? What do you think?
I think, yeah, if you think people are basically good, then you probably also think they can be, brought back to being good again.
That's right. And they said you do this by appealing to a person's natural instincts, trying to return them or connect them to their natural state, especially via the emotions. Making someone cry, then, could make them good again. Picture, for example, the evil villain smirking at his latest robbery and theft, who happens to see a lost child walking down the street sobbing, and he starts to sniffle and cry, and maybe his heart goes out to this lost child, and he wants to help the child, and somehow he realizes that he's been bad, or rather been behaving badly, since according to sentimentalist theory, he was never truly bad to begin with. All right, that's sort of the hallmark of sentimentality, and it's what became the driving force behind sentimental comedies.
I don't get why they're comedies. They don't sound funny.
Well, you're right. A sentimental comedy is not specifically funny. The goal isn't to make the audience laugh. In fact, the goal's to make the audience cry. Thus, a sentimental comedy will usually depict someone virtuous, but in some sort of distress. Perhaps a good, virtuous man or woman who's suffering financial hardships, and we see them desperate for food, barely able to survive, tempted to rob someone. But they resist that temptation and still triumph in the end. And again, seeing this, the audience is expected to cry, and thus reconnect with their natural emotional state.
What is the lecture mainly about? Why does the professor mention social contract theory? According to the professor, what two questions did sentimental theorists need to answer about their theory? According to the professor, what is a typical sentimental comedy usually about? What does the professor imply is the fundamental objective of sentimental comedies? What does the professor imply when he says this?
Now, in order to sort of get our heads around what a sentimental comedy is, where it came from, and why on earth it was so popular, we need to understand what sentimentality was as a philosophical movement.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a librarian.
Hi, can I help you?
I hope so.
Okay.
I need to find an article in a journal called Contemporary Research in Linguistics, and I've looked all over the stacks for it, but I can't find it anywhere. Could you look to see if it's been checked out?
Okay, that may not be the problem.
But I just checked the computer catalog over there, and it's listed there, and it says it's available.
When you looked up the book locator number, did you see the letters LAN?
Oh, okay, yeah, I saw that, but I didn't know what it meant.
Well, that means it's in the language department library. We don't have it here.
Oh.
Yes, the university actually has 9 libraries, so you always have to check the library code when you're looking for a book.
Oh, okay. But it is available, but not in this library?
Right. But we do have a number of other linguistics journals here.
No, I need this one specifically. This article's mentioned in a bunch of other articles I've already read, and I wanted to have a look at the original, this one. You know, in case there's more stuff I could use in my paper.
Okay. Well, all the university libraries share their resources, so if you like, I could call the language department library and ask them to send it over, and we'd have it for you here, day after tomorrow around noon.
Oh, I appreciate that, but I can't wait that long. I need this article for a paper I'm writing that's due the day after tomorrow. Could you tell me where the language department library is?
Sure. It's on the other campus in the basement of Pearson Hall, across from the listening lab. But I doubt you'll be able to make it over there in time today.
No, especially since I don't have a car. But my sister does, and I'm pretty sure she'd let me borrow it. If I go over there first thing tomorrow morning, will I be able to check it out right away?
I don't see why not. Just make sure you have your student ID with you.
Okay, that's what I'll do then. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Why does the man go to talk to the librarian? What does the man learn about the library's computer catalog? What does the librarian offer to do to help the man? Why does the man need to talk to his sister? What does the librarian imply when she says this?
Sure. It's on the other campus in the basement of Pearson Hall, across from the listening lab. But I doubt you'll be able to make it over there in time today.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Okay, I'd like to get started, please. Today we're going to look at some very unusual plants and animals that have evolved on some remote ocean islands. And of course, when I say that, the first thing that probably comes to mind is...
The Galapagos Islands.
Right, the Galapagos Islands, which are located...
In the Pacific Ocean off the coast of South America.
That's right, about 600 miles off the coast. And being so isolated from the mainland, the species that developed there were quite different from those that developed on the mainland. And of course, after Charles Darwin observed all of this, it got his wheels turning, and he eventually came up with his famous theory of natural selection. And that's why you've all heard of the Galapagos Islands. But we're not going to talk about the Galapagos Islands today. No. Way out in the middle of the Indian Ocean, somewhere between Africa and India, there's another little cluster of islands. Not nearly as famous, but every bit as fascinating in my opinion. A little group of islands called the Seychelles. Now, how many have heard of them? Okay, a few of you then. Well, it just so happens that I spent some time in the Seychelles a few years ago. So they're kind of close to my heart. And just like in the Galapagos Islands, an amazing variety of unusual species have evolved there. Things you won't find anywhere else in the world. For example, one of the things I saw there was a tiny frog that's not a whole lot bigger than an ant. In fact, it's one of the smallest vertebrates on Earth. Okay, here's a little mystery for you. You rarely get frogs colonizing remote ocean islands like the Seychelles. You have some other animals that an ocean current could carry out there from the mainland, but frogs are too delicate. They couldn't withstand the salt and the sun and so on for that length of time. So, how do you think the ancestors of these little frogs got there? Ken?
People brought them?
Good guess. People have been responsible for transporting a lot of species from one place to another.
Oh, maybe there used to be some kind of land bridge that used to connect the islands to the mainland? You know, like the one that used to connect Asia and North America?
That's close, Ken. Actually, the theory is, millions and millions of years ago, the Earth had only two huge land masses, two supercontinents. And then, around 200 million years ago, part of one of these land masses broke away and began to move slowly out into the ocean. And as that chunk moved away, fragments of it also broke off and were left behind. And that's how the Seychelles formed. And, so the theory goes, many of the plants and animals living on these islands were stranded out there in the middle of the ocean and isolated from the mainland. These tiny frogs are just one of the species descended from those stranded species. Diane?
I'm just curious, how did they figure out that the Seychelles were once part of one big continent?
Okay, that's a fair question. Well, there are two ways that I know of. First, you have some species in the Seychelles whose closest relatives are in Asia. And then you have others there that have distant relatives in both Asia and Africa. Now, of course, various species of animals and plants can drift or fly from island to island. So that in itself doesn't prove anything. And then I'm not a geologist, so I don't know all the details. But I do know that part of how they came to that conclusion was because the Seychelles are made up of solid granite bedrock. Granite is a type of rock that's typical of continents. Islands are typically made of volcanic rock. So if an island's made of granite, that suggests that it once was part of a continent. In fact, the Seychelles are the only islands in the middle of an ocean made of solid granite. The Galapagos Islands, the Hawaiian Islands, they're products of underwater volcanoes. Their composition's very different from that of the Seychelles. Okay, where was I? Okay. Okay, so then you had a relatively small number of plants and animals isolated for a long time out in the middle of the ocean, maybe with a few newcomers drifting in now and then. And so you got some very interesting things evolving. And speaking of that, I just happened to have with me a few hundred slides I took when I was there. No, just kidding. But I do have a few slides of some things you've probably never seen before. All right, would someone get the lights, please?
What is the lecture mainly about? Why does the professor first mention the Galapagos Islands? According to the professor, why is it unusual to find frogs on remote ocean islands? The professor mentions evidence that suggests that the Seychelles were once part of a continent. What evidence does the professor mention? What do the Seychelles and the Galapagos Islands have in common? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
So, how do you think the ancestors of these little frogs got there? Ken?
People brought them?
Good guess. People have been responsible for transporting a lot of species from one place to another.
What does the professor imply when she says this?
Good guess. People have been responsible for transporting a lot of species from one place to another.
Listen to part of a lecture in a United States history class.
I'd like to talk today about an important paradigm in the history of the United States and how it came to be changed upon a second look. In 1893, an eminent American historian by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a lecture at the American Historical Association. And his lecture was entitled The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Now, when he was talking about the frontier, he was referring to the part of the American West that wasn't yet settled. The point Turner made in his lecture was that the 1890 U.S. Census had provided new data about settlement, and those data showed that, well, there was no longer a frontier. This disappearance of the frontier seemed to him tremendously significant and prompted him to gather ideas about how the frontier might have shaped American history and the American character. Turner asserted that the existence of a frontier with cheap or virtually free land for the taking, available for individuals to sort of try their luck, tended to promote certain ideals that were central to the American character. Ideals of economic self-sufficiency, individualism, political independence, small-town democracy, suspicion of large government, things like that. He saw these things being really shaped by the economic and social conditions of the frontier. And for Turner, the end of the frontier in 1890 meant the end of this particular era of American character, and that Americans would become less individualistic, less independent-minded. And the frontier thesis was pretty much the accepted paradigm of the history of the American West until the 1970s. Then, for a variety of reasons, historians studying the American West began to question this thesis, and ultimately, many of them ended up pretty much turning it on its head. And this is what fascinates me about this debate. the change that happened was not so much a matter of people finding new evidence that hadn't been available to Turner. It was more a question of people looking at the same evidence with a different eye, with different emphases. There are two main areas of challenge to Turner that arose in what's been called the New Western history. One was that Turner tended to overemphasize the importance of Americans of European descent on the Western frontier. This was somewhat of an unconscious bias on his part, but if you looked at Turner's picture of the frontier, it was basically white men from Europe who set the tone and defined the culture. New Western historians took another look at the West and realized that it was actually a pretty culturally diverse place. You had obviously American Indians, Mexicans, Chinese, and others. So the cultural uniformity of the frontier that Turner saw, the New Western historians look at it and see something very, very different. The other main area of challenge by the New Western historians was that Turner really, in their view, underestimated the role of the federal government and large corporations in shaping the economic life of the frontier. I mean, just as for instance, the federal government to this day is the largest landowner west of the Mississippi River. And people's lives, when they got to the frontier, were really dictated by market forces pretty much beyond their control. You grew wheat, you exported it to Europe, and whether you prospered or not depended at least partly on the price of wheat, which you had relatively little control over. So these two main areas of challenge result in a very different picture of the Western frontier. The New Western historians see a culturally diverse place, a place where people weren't really in charge of their destiny, even before the end of the frontier. People their destinies were controlled by large impersonal forces, federal policy, changes in the prices of agricultural products, things like that. For Turner, the end of the availability of cheap land marks a crucial change in United States history. But for the New Western historians, it's really more of the same, a continuation of the same kind of conflicts that had gone on in the days before the so-called closing of the frontier. So, again, as I say, it's so interesting because it's a case of a shift in perception rather than a shift in the underlying evidence that guided the initial perception.
What aspect of the American West is the lecture mainly about? What point did Turner emphasize in his lecture about the American frontier? What point does the professor emphasize when she discusses the ideas of Turner and the New Western historians? Indicate for each statement whether it reflects Turner's view of the American West or the view of the New Western historians. With which statement about Turner would the New Western historians most likely agree? Why does the professor say this?
This was somewhat of an unconscious bias on his part, but if you looked at Turner's picture of the frontier, it was basically white men from Europe who set the tone and defined the culture.